Here's a quick follow-up. In our last video, we made this successfully generate random items every time we click. And now the question is, how do I make that happen on a timer? So JavaScript has many ways to do timers. I'll show you 3 of them in this video. The simplest way, given that we're using my game library, is to just use the library we already have. If you remember, every time we add a drawing, we use this add drawing function, and that function is called as quickly as the browser can animate, basically. So the browser will decide when to call it based on an internal method called request animation frame, which depends on the speed of the device, to make a smooth animation. So that's going to be called somewhere between 20 and 60 times a second, something like that, and that's a lot. So an easy way using my game library would be to just make a drawing, because really all a drawing is a function that's called 20 times a second. So and if we wanted to, we could store it. So we could say, all right, our timer is a game add drawing, and then that drawing is going to have the time. So, for example, it gets elapsed and it gets step time. Those are probably the 2 most useful things to have. Now, if we wanted to do something, let's say every 5 seconds we want to create a new shape, we could then make a new variable for the shape. So last new shape drawn at equals 0. And then we can check if elapsed minus last new shape drawn at. So that's going to be the number of milliseconds minus whatever milliseconds I drew it at, right? Is greater than, and then we can make a new variable called draw every, and let's say 5,000 milliseconds, so every 5 seconds, or I'll make it every 2 seconds so it's quicker to see in the testing, is greater than draw every. I'll put a unit on that, draw every milliseconds, draw every milliseconds. And then here we can just call whatever function we might want to do. So I'll say something like make rect. Now this is a little dangerous because we're inside a callback that runs every 20 to 50 times a second, right? And what we're doing here when we add a drawing is we're adding a new callback. So that's something that could set up what we would call exponential growth. So because if every function makes a function that makes a function, right, we could be in trouble. So we want to be careful. One logic error I'm about to make that I'm going to stop before I crash my browser is if I don't reset the last new shape drawn at, then my function will just keep calling repeatedly. And again, it will call like 20 times a second. So it's a little frightening to do it this way. But it's simple and you don't have to learn any outside functions. So now this is going to call this thing every 20 seconds. And I'll go ahead and just call, I had a make random shape thing, didn't I? In this click handler. So I could take that same code. I'm copy pasting code, which is bad practice. I probably should make that into a function, but I just want this to work quickly, so I'm going to ignore my own good advice. And we saw, there we go. We're getting a new shape pretty regularly. It looks like every 2 seconds. If I want to confirm when this drawing is happening, I can throw a log statement in. Now a log, again, inside of an add drawing is dangerous because you can be writing 20 log statements a second. But this one's in an if statement, so there it is. See, it calls it 2,000, 4,000. Here we go, 2,000, 4,000, 602. So we can see, this is firing quickly enough. We're within 3 or 4 milliseconds of the time we want it to run at, right? So there it is at 16, 24 milliseconds late, 25 milliseconds late, 26. So this code is running pretty often. One interesting thing we can notice actually is it will get later and later the more we go because the computer's doing more work per animation frame, right? As we have more animations up there. And the first one was like only 1 millisecond late. Now these are running at 33, 34, 35 milliseconds. So we can see how long it actually takes the computer to get around to that add drawing function. Because remember, every animation frame, it has to re-render everything on the screen, so it's not just your drawing. So this kind of code is a little dangerous in that it is anytime you set up a timer with new stuff showing up, you're potentially going to overwhelm the computer. You can have, if you just leave the browser open for an hour, you're going to have your computer really working very hard, and it's going to have way too many items. So this isn't a pattern I'd recommend. There's a few tricks you could use to fix it. One would be to just add a counter variable. So here's a max drawings counter that would just say, okay, let's make sure that we never have more than X drawings. So I could throw in the variable there, and we could say, and then we'd also need a counter variable for how many of these we've drawn, right? So we'd say drawings plus equals 1, and then if drawings is less than max drawings, we put an if statement, and this will make the game just stop generating new drawings once we get to 100. Of course, your game might have some logic where you want to do something else. There is actually in my library the ability to replace a drawing so that we're not just adding new ones all the time. That might be a performance benefit. So this will never draw more than 100. Let me make it a smaller number here. I'll make it never draw more than 10. And then we'll actually see it stop. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And is the log statement in the if? It is. So we should see this new shape stop logging eventually. Yeah, looks like the 18-second one was the last one it did. So there we go. It did in fact stop. And eventually all of these are programmed to disappear, so they will all disappear eventually. So, that was the wrong number for this. I mean, you could even set a very large max drawings like 10,000. It's just a little more responsible programming. You never want to set up a program that's just going to gobble up more and more memory forever, because a user might just leave that thing open, walk away, have dinner, come back to their computer, and now their computer doesn't really work because your program just gobbled up all the memory the computer had to store drawings that it had already deleted. So, all right, so that works well. I promised I'd show you a couple other ways to do this in this video, so I will do that quickly. JavaScript has built in a set interval and a set timeout function. And those are very similar to these. The game's add drawing uses the request animation frame, which again is meant for handling animations. But here, we'll do this the set timeout way. It's going to look very similar in that we're going to have a we're going to use a function, right? So the common pattern in JavaScript is we're always saying, let's call a function at some time. But set timeout says do this thing in such and such amount of time, and then maybe do it again. And set interval says do this thing over and over again. So I guess we should go ahead and use set interval since we do want this to happen over and over again. And the way set interval works is it takes a function, and then it takes the number of milliseconds. So now I don't need this elapsed or this step time because the other function was being called 20 times a second. This function will only be called every 2 seconds, so that's simpler. You'll notice over here this error is happening because elapsed is not defined, and that's because we don't need elapsed. So we don't need any of this if statement. So the function actually gets much simpler this way. All we're going to do in set interval, I'll keep in the good check I made to check if we'd had too many drawings. So if drawings is less than max drawings, and then we get rid of elapsed. That's not a thing anymore. New shape. And we will then have the old drawing function code, whatever code you want to run. I don't need to keep track of when the last shape was drawn, so that's kind of nice. I do need to increment my counter. I don't know where that went, so we'll go drawings plus equals 1. So this whole function now says set an interval and grab the drawing function, run the drawing function, add to the count. One last thing we should do, it's not ever good to set an interval and then forget about it, because again, that will run forever or until the user closes the program. So what JavaScript does is set interval returns an ID, like a special number, which says this is interval number 3 or something. Actually, my game program works exactly the same way. I copied the JavaScript API there. And then you can use that to clear the interval. So here I'm going to do an else statement that says basically, if we're done, I'm going to call clear interval, and clear interval gets the interval ID, and that will stop the program from running. So let's see, if I manage to make no syntax errors, this will work. All right, I had missed a comma is what I did there. So the function ends here. The 2000 is how often we're doing it, so every 2 seconds. And there's the new shapes running. To feel like a responsible programmer, I want to just see that my clear interval works. So I'm going to set the max drawings to 2 so that I can see it draw right away. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And it should stop making new shapes. It looks like it did. I guess I could have thrown a log statement in to see that working, but I think this is, yeah, there my shapes are disappearing. So there, that successfully stopped it. I guess the other thing to do to be a responsible programmer, this draw every MS I can get rid of because now that's right in that function. I don't need that variable anymore. So this is much simpler. We set an interval ID to the interval, and then every 2 seconds we call this function, and then here's the function we want to run. So really we're just saying run this function at this time. All right, and that's how you use intervals. Some programmers prefer to use a timeout, which is the third way to do it. I'll show you that way too. So in the timeout, it's very similar to, in fact, if I just change this to set timeout, it would basically work, but it would only call it once. So if I do it with the timeout method, we see that I got the 4th shape, and it didn't call it again. So in that case, we don't actually necessarily need to keep track of that ID and clear it, so we'll get rid of that clearing code. And what we would do is, I'm going to change this logic up a little bit. Instead of saying if we're over the max, draw it, I'm going to say here, if we are under the max, call ourselves again. Now, the problem is timeout isn't currently a function. So now I have to wrap this whole thing in another function. Draw on timer. And I can use recursion, which students sometimes find a little mind-bending, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to call draw on timer right here. All right, so what does draw on timer do? Draw on timer sets a timeout to do this drawing in 2 seconds, and then if we're not over the max, it calls itself again. Looks like okay, and now no new shapes are appearing because I forgot to call draw on timer, so I need to actually call draw on timer. I can do that anywhere. It's probably better actually to do it down here after the game runs, because the draw on timer won't really do anything if the game's not running, but it doesn't really matter. All right, so there it goes, 4, 5, and I still have it set to max out at 2, so that's all the shapes we'll get. But I can set this thing to 2000 or something, and then it will effectively run forever. But there'll be some limit to how much memory it gobbles up. from the poor computer. All right, so there you go. That's the three methods. You can use the built-in game function, you can use set interval or set timeout. All three methods will work fine. Set interval is probably the clearest, but it has that risk of running forever if you don't think it through. Draw on timer is pretty nice, but you have to get your head around recursion. And then if you don't want to do either of those, just using the built-in game library is nice, but you do have to set the extra variables to do it. Hope that helps.